scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George arrived at their playgroup. The classroom looked exactly as it always did, with purple tables, yellow chairs, and colorful learning posters. But something felt different today. The air seemed thicker, and the usual cheerful chatter was replaced by unsettling silence. Madame Gazelle was standing at the front of the classroom, but her smile seemed wider than usual, stretching unnaturally across her face. Her eyes appeared to be watching everyone at once, never blinking. When she spoke, her voice had a strange echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The children took their seats as they always did. Peppa sat next to Susie Sheep, while George clutched his dinosaur toy. But as the morning progressed, the toys around the classroom began to move on their own. A teddy bear's head turned slightly. A toy car rolled across the table. During story time, Madame Gazelle opened a book with completely blank pages. Yet she began reading from them as if they contained the most fascinating tale. Her voice grew deeper and more hypnotic with each word, and the children found themselves unable to look away from the empty pages. The classroom windows began to fog up from the inside. Strange shapes appeared in the condensation, handprints too small to belong to any of the children, and words written in an unknown language. The shapes would appear and disappear, always just at the edge of their vision. When it was time for outdoor play, the playground equipment had changed. The slide was now impossibly tall, stretching up into the cloudy sky. The swings moved back and forth on their own, creaking in a rhythm that sounded like a lullaby. The sandbox had turned into a perfect circle of black sand. Peppa and her friends stood at the edge of the playground, unsure whether to venture out. As they hesitated, they noticed that their shadows were moving independently of their bodies. The shadow children were playing different games, making different gestures. The sky above began to darken, though it was still mid-morning. Clouds gathered in unnatural formations, creating shapes that looked like enormous faces peering down at them. Inside the school building, they could hear footsteps in the empty corridors, slow, deliberate steps that echoed through the halls. Madame Gazelle appeared beside them without warning. Her smile was even wider now, and when she spoke, her voice seemed to come from multiple directions. She suggested they play a new game, close their eyes, and count to 100. The children agreed to play this strange game. They closed their eyes tightly and began to count together. But as they counted, they could hear the world around them changing. The sounds of the playground equipment grew louder and more distorted. When they reached 100 and opened their eyes, everything was exactly as it had always been. The slide was its normal height, the swings hung still, and the sandbox contained ordinary golden sand. But as they walked back toward the classroom, Peppa noticed something that made her stomach turn cold. In the sand beneath their feet, she could see footprints that led to places they had never actually walked, arranged in patterns that told the story of a morning that had somehow both happened and not happened at all. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family house when Peppa noticed something strange about her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Instead of her usual cheerful smile, the reflection seemed to be frowning, and its eyes appeared darker than they should be. When Peppa waved her hand, the reflection moved a second too late, as if it was thinking about whether to copy her movements. George was playing with his dinosaur toys in the living room when he heard whispers coming from inside his toy box. The whispers were soft at first, like wind through leaves, but gradually became clearer. They were calling his name, but the voice didn't belong to anyone in his family. When he opened the toy box to investigate, all his toys had turned to face him, their plastic eyes somehow more alive than before. Mummy Pig was cooking dinner in the kitchen when she noticed that the vegetables she was cutting kept rearranging themselves when she wasn't looking. Carrots would roll into perfect circles, potatoes would stack themselves into tiny pyramids, and the onions seemed to be watching her with their layered rings that looked disturbingly like eyes. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in his favorite chair when the words on the page began to change. The headlines shifted from normal news to messages that seemed directed specifically at him. "Daddy Pig should look behind him," read one line. "The shadows are moving," warned another. When he finally turned around, He saw that his shadow on the wall was standing up while he remained seated. As night fell, the family gathered for dinner, but none of them mentioned the strange things they had experienced. They ate in unusual silence, each lost in their own unsettling thoughts. The grandfather clock in the hallway began chiming 13 times instead of the usual 12, and with each extra chime, the room seemed to grow a little darker. Peppa excused herself to go to bed early, but as she climbed the stairs, she could hear footsteps following her that didn't match her own rhythm. When she reached the top and looked back, there was no one there, but she could see wet footprints on the carpet that definitely weren't hers. In her bedroom, Peppa's toys had arranged themselves in a perfect circle around her bed. Her teddy bear sat in the center, and for the first time, she noticed that its button eyes seemed to be looking directly at her. When she tried to move the toys back to their usual places, they felt heavier than normal, as if they were resisting her efforts. George's room was even stranger. His dinosaur toys had formed what looked like a prehistoric hunting formation, all facing toward his bed. The toy dinosaurs' mouths were open in silent roars, and their tiny plastic teeth seemed sharper than he remembered. When he tried to play with them, they wouldn't move from their positions. Downstairs, Mummy and Daddy Pig were cleaning up after dinner when they realized that the dishes were washing themselves. Plates floated gently in the soapy water, scrubbing themselves clean, while cups and saucers arranged themselves neatly in the cupboards without any human help. The house itself seemed to be changing. Doors that were usually easy to open now required extra effort, as if something on the other side was gently pushing back. Windows that had been closed were found open, letting in a cold breeze that carried whispers in a language none of them recognized. As the family finally settled into bed, they each lay awake listening to the sounds of the house. Creaking floorboards suggested someone was walking around, but when they checked, the hallways were empty. The walls seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting ever so slightly, as if the house itself had come alive. In the morning, everything returned to normal, but the family never spoke about that strange night. They went about their usual routines, but each of them occasionally glanced at mirrors a little longer, listened to their toys a little more carefully, and paid closer attention to the shadows that danced around their cheerful, colorful world. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa discovered something strange in her bedroom. The toys on her shelf had moved during the night, arranged in a perfect circle around her bed. George noticed it too. His dinosaur collection was facing the same direction, all staring at the door with their plastic eyes. Mummy Pig dismissed their concerns with her usual smile, but there was something different about her expression. Her eyes seemed to linger on empty spaces, as if she could see something the children couldn't. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper, but the pages never turned, and his glasses reflected images that weren't in the room. The next morning at playgroup, their friends were acting strangely. Susie Sheep spoke in whispers about dreams where children walked in circles around the playground at midnight. Pedro Pony mentioned seeing Madame Gazelle standing motionless in the classroom after dark, her eyes wide open, never blinking. During snack time, the juice boxes tasted metallic and cold. When Peppa looked at her apple, she could swear she saw tiny faces pressed against the skin from inside, their mouths moving silently. The playground equipment began to move on its own swings swayed without wind. The seesaw tilted with no one on it. As the day progressed, Peppa realized everyone was repeating the same conversations from yesterday. Word for word, gesture for gesture, as if following an invisible script. When she tried to point this out to George, he just smiled and said exactly what he had said before, at exactly the same time. The shadows began to move independently of their owners. Peppa watched in horror as her own shadow waved at her from the wall, its movements completely separate from her own. The shadow children played different games than the real children, their dark forms dancing in patterns that hurt to look at. When Mummy Pig arrived to collect them, something was wrong with her car. The windows were tinted so dark that nothing could be seen inside, and the radio played a children's song backwards, the melody twisted into something unrecognizable yet familiar. At dinner, the food kept changing when no one was looking. The kitchen clock ticked backwards, and the pictures on the wall showed the family in poses they had never made, in places they had never been. That night, Peppa heard footsteps in the hallway that stopped outside her door. The doorknob turned slowly, but when the door opened, no one was there. Just the hallway stretching longer than it should, with doors that led to rooms that didn't exist. George appeared walking backwards, his eyes closed, speaking in a voice that wasn't his own about the place where lost episodes go. The house began to shift around them. Rooms rearranged themselves, stairs led to different floors, and windows showed impossible views. The family photos began to move, showing the same scenes over and over, but each time slightly different, slightly wrong. As the night deepened, Peppa realized they might not be in their real house anymore, but in some other version where the rules were different and nothing was as it should be. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across the walls. As she walked downstairs for breakfast, she noticed that all the family photos on the wall had changed. In every picture, the faces were slightly wrong, smiles too wide, eyes too dark, expressions frozen in unnatural positions. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen making breakfast, but when she turned around, her usual warm smile had been replaced by something that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, Peppa," she said in a voice that sounded like her own, but with an odd echo that seemed to come from somewhere far away. The pancakes on the plate were perfectly round, too perfect, and they never seemed to get cold no matter how long they sat there. George came bouncing down the stairs, clutching his beloved dinosaur toy, but something was wrong with Mr. Dinosaur too. The toy's plastic eyes seemed to follow Peppa wherever she moved, and sometimes she could swear she heard tiny roars coming from its motionless mouth. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the windows, and everything seemed normal. Mummy Pig was making breakfast downstairs, and Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper. But something was different about this day, something that none of them could have imagined. As Peppa brushed her teeth, she noticed her reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed to move just a moment after she did. When she stopped brushing, her reflection continued for just a second longer. George noticed it too when he came to wash his face. Their reflections had dark, hollow eyes that seemed to stare back at them with an unsettling intensity. During breakfast, the family sat around their usual table, but the food tasted strange. The cereal seemed to whisper when they poured the milk, and the toast made soft crying sounds when they bit into it. Mummy Pig's smile never left her face, even when she wasn't looking at anyone. Daddy Pig's newspaper had no words, just pictures of empty rooms and shadows. When they went outside to play, the playground was completely silent. No other children were there, no birds were singing, and even the wind had stopped. The swings moved by themselves, creaking back and forth with no one on them. The slide seemed longer than usual, disappearing into darkness at the bottom. Peppa and George decided to visit their friends, but when they knocked on Susie Sheep's door, no one answered. Through the window, they could see Susie sitting at her table, but she wasn't moving at all. Her eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, and her mouth was frozen in a smile that was too wide. As they walked through the town, they realized that everyone was like this. Pedro Pony stood motionless in his garden. Rebecca Rabbit sat perfectly still on her porch, and all their friends had the same empty stare and unnatural smile. The whole town had become a collection of living dolls. When they returned home, Mummy and Daddy Pig were sitting in the living room, but they too had changed. Their eyes had become completely black, and their smiles stretched impossibly wide across their faces. They spoke in perfect unison, their voices echoing strangely in the room. The house itself began to change around them. The walls started to breathe slowly, expanding and contracting like lungs. The pictures on the walls showed scenes that moved and shifted, displaying moments that had never happened. The stairs seemed to multiply, leading to rooms that shouldn't exist. Peppa and George ran to their bedroom, but it was no longer the same room they had woken up in. The toys had arranged themselves in perfect circles, all facing the center of the room. Their teddy bears had button eyes that followed their every movement, and the dollhouse contained tiny figures that looked exactly like their family. As night fell, the darkness outside was absolute. No stars, no moon, just an endless black void pressing against the windows. The house creaked and groaned, and strange shadows moved across the walls without anything to cast them. Peppa and George hugged each other tightly, wondering if they would ever see the real world again. The last thing they heard before everything went silent was the sound of their own voices, coming from somewhere else in the house, laughing and playing as if nothing had ever been wrong. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across her toys. As she got dressed, Peppa noticed that her reflection in the mirror was moving just a fraction of a second too late. Downstairs in the kitchen, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her usual cheerful humming had been replaced by an eerie silence. When Peppa looked closely, she realized that Mummy Pig's eyes weren't blinking at all. They just stared straight ahead, unmoving, while her hands mechanically stirred the porridge in perfect, rhythmic circles. George was already at the breakfast table, but he wasn't playing with his dinosaur toy. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching Peppa with eyes that seemed too wide and too dark. When Peppa tried to speak to him, George's mouth opened, but instead of his usual babbling, only a low, continuous whisper emerged. The house itself began to feel wrong. The familiar yellow walls of the kitchen seemed to pulse gently, as if they were breathing. The cheerful family photos on the walls showed the same smiling faces, but now their eyes followed Peppa wherever she moved. The clock on the wall had stopped at exactly midnight, even though bright daylight filled the room. When Daddy Pig came down for breakfast, he moved with jerky, puppet-like motions, his glasses reflecting nothing but darkness. As the family sat around the breakfast table, they all turned to look at Peppa simultaneously, their heads moving in perfect unison like synchronized dolls. The porridge in Peppa's bowl began to move on its own, swirling in patterns that formed shapes she didn't want to recognize. The spoon in her hand felt ice cold, and when she looked down, she saw that her own reflection in the metal surface was smiling a smile she wasn't making. Outside, the world had become equally strange. The trees in the garden stood motionless despite a wind that Peppa could hear but not feel. The birds in the sky hung suspended like they were painted on glass. Even the muddy puddles that Peppa loved so much had turned into perfect black mirrors. As the day progressed, more family members arrived for what seemed like a normal visit, but each one moved with the same unnatural stillness. The toys in Peppa's room had rearranged themselves into perfect circles, and her beloved teddy bear now had button eyes that seemed to follow her movements. When bedtime finally came, Peppa climbed the stairs that seemed to stretch longer with each step. Her bedroom door was exactly where it should be, but when she opened it, the room beyond was not quite the same room she had woken up in that morning. As Peppa lay in her bed, she could hear the house settling around her, but the sounds were too rhythmic, too purposeful. The last thing Peppa remembered before sleep